Okay, welcome everybody. Um, Usually it takes like a few minutes for people to file in. So we'll just, yeah, here we go. Some people are popping in. I'll go ahead and begin. And while people are virtually taking their seat, you can listen. So hello, welcome. This is the second of the fall 2022 Sara Little Turnbull Visiting Designer Speaker Series, where we talk to various luminaries in the world of design, art, science, and activism. And today we're actually talking to a design educator as well. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. This semester, we're focusing on cross-cultural design. And it's a very broad term, as our guests can tell you, but it's basically, we're going to be discussing how user-focused designers should best respond to users from different cultures, whether there really is such a thing as universal design, how do artists and designers respond to the blending of cultures, what happens when cultures mix and when they don't mix, and how do we best harness the dialogue between cultures? And lastly, how does the mixture of cultures, the blending of cultures reverberate through history? And tonight we're actually going to be talking about how does, potentially, I hope we can talk about how does systemic racism play into this? How does race and ethnicity play into how design cultures travel through history and how they're represented today? Just a note, this series is running concurrently with Abya Yala, the Structural Origins exhibition. It's currently in the Lehman College Art Gallery. This semester, the Art Gallery is participating in the New York Latin American Art Triennial. And this exhibition opened on the 21st of September and will conclude on January 28th. So you have zero reason not to go check it out if you're on campus. This lecture series is also a component of a design course. And I think, Lesley-Ann, I think I told you this, there are students here, right, as part of a class. They're in class right now and they're watching us, and hopefully they'll have questions for us as we move along tonight. We really love to hear questions. Of course, this is also open to the public. So public, if you have questions, you're also free to use the Q&A section. And it looks like, oh, there's already a couple questions, but this is great. So keep them, it's more of like a, hey there, less of a question. So anyway, our guest today is Lesley-Ann Noel, who practices design through emancipatory, critical, and anti-hegemonic lenses, focusing on equity, social justice, and the experiences of people who are often excluded from design research. Her research also highlights the work of designers outside of Europe and North America as an act of decolonizing design. She also attempts to promote greater critical awareness amongst designers and design students by introducing critical theory concepts and vocabulary into the design studio, for example, through her Designer's Critical Alphabet, which hopefully we'll have, I want to talk about that tonight. Lesley-Ann's research interests are emancipatory research centered around the perspectives of those who would traditionally be excluded from the research, community-led research, design-based learning, and design thinking. She practices primarily in the area of social innovation, education, and public health. She is co-chair of the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group of the Design Research Society. Lesley-Ann, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, David. I mean, that's what, like an hour-long intro.
Yeah, no, you got a lot of stuff going on. You're also the author of a couple books I want to talk about, so we have a lot to get through. But I thought perhaps you could kind of just briefly give us your origin story, like how you came to design and teaching design, and where, give us the lowdown on that.
All right. So, like I actually worked it out a little while ago. I've been in design since middle school
Oh, wow.
because, yeah, that's a long time. Because in our high schools, high school and middle school in Trinidad, or maybe let me start there, right? So
Yeah, start in Trinidad.
yes,
Yeah.
I'm from Trinidad and Tobago in the
Okay.
Caribbean, right? And if anyone is from Trinidad, you could say hi in the chat,
Yeah,
right?
please do.
And I so I'll get to the middle school story. In our high schools and middle schools in Trinidad, you choose a track pretty early. So, like maybe in about ninth grade, you decide what path you're on. And I actually started doing design then, started imagining myself as a designer way back then. The way I've imagined myself as a designer has changed over time. So initially, I thought I would have been a graphic designer. And then I went to Brazil to do university, to study at university because, which was all by chance. I thought I would have gone to school in New York, like a lot of people do, right? Like people in this room do. And then I applied to all of those schools in New York and got into quite a few. And then somebody sent me maybe an invoice and said, well, okay, yes, you're accepted and this is what it will cost. I was like, oh my God, I guess
Yeah,
I'm not going to go to
yeah,
school in New York.
yeah.
But I ended up in Brazil, where was free for me. I got a scholarship, and I spent close to 6 years in Brazil doing industrial design at undergrad and postgrad level. And then from there, I worked as a consultant in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania. Went back to Trinidad, taught for many years. Um, and somehow ended up in Raleigh, North Carolina, with a few other stops along the way. So I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina right now.
Okay, interesting. I mean, I feel like that story resonates very much so with a lot of our students. A lot there's a lot of parallels. Also, the other thing you mentioned, which I think is really interesting, is you said when you first thought about design, you're thinking, "Oh, I want to be a graphic designer." And that is I mean, that's like right out of the mouths of many of our students. And then they learn, "Oh, design is like this much bigger thing. It's about considering the user." And tonight we're going to see it's about considering other cultures and how to like create a language for other cultures. It should be its own school entirely, but and it is in some cases. But you wanted to present some of your work, right? Some of your research.
Yes,
Oh, and
yes,
just one question, what's the painting behind you? That was
yes. I was just
yeah,
looking at that,
yeah,
and I tried to answer and I
I
didn't.
can answer.
So
Yeah. I
yeah, so it's a work by Che Lovelace, right? And he's a Trinidadian
mhm.
artist who I asked for permission early on in the pandemic. I'm like, can I use your artwork as my
Yeah, it's
background?
beautiful.
And yeah, and
Yeah.
some of his artwork will be in one of the books that I'll be working on.
Okay.
And yes, yes.
Excellent, excellent.
All right. So like I have 6 million slides, which we don't have to
Sure.
go through.
Hmm.
um, but I have like a range of different things that I
Yeah,
wouldn't mind sharing with people.
sure. Go for it. Yeah.
So I am gonna start sharing. Let's see. All right. So you should be seeing me.
Yep.
Well, you
Yep.
got a little bit of about me already.
Yeah.
Um, I just like to show this version of the world map because I'm in a lot of global south
Hmm.
conversations, and
Hmm.
this came up in one of our meetings last week where we were saying, well, why do we show the map the other way around, right? So this is my south-centric world map. And this, I suppose you could think of as what guides the work that I do. Because a lot of what I do, I'm from the global south. I did my undergraduate education in another country in the global south. I
Hmm.
did a lot of work, in the Caribbean, in East Africa. So, I mean, really, that is what centers the world that I'm in and the
Yeah.
kind of work that I do. So, a
Yeah.
lot of the work that I do is around power, agency, access, emancipation, and words like that, where maybe I'm trying to shift power in the work that I'm doing. I'm trying to make sure that people who wouldn't typically have access have access. I'm trying to demonstrate that people already have agency or something like that. Because in some of the work that we do as designers, we kind of forget things like this, that people already have agency, people already have power. And so I try to keep some of that in mind. And I I'm not in, I guess, traditional design practice anymore. I'm a design researcher and an academic researcher. So some of what I present to you might seem very academic. It's not like typical graphic design and graphic design practice. It's design research that's applied in a slightly different way, right?
Right.
Um,
Ideas. Yeah.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes,
Yeah.
some ideas. So let's see, where can I start? I'm actually going to start with some design methods or design tools that I've become a little bit known for. And so this first tool, I'll call it, is called the positionality wheel, where so when I started to do research, more academic research, I learned that some researchers will write something called a positionality statement at the start of their research, where they say who they are. You know, they'll describe their race, their ethnicity, their age. They'll say, well, I'm a parent and I have 3 children. And all of that is to help us understand where they're coming from in their research. And then I thought about that a lot of us as designers don't do that. You know, we don't explicitly say who we are, you know, and sometimes we'll present the work that we do in a kind of objective way and, you know, kind of at arm's length, you know, and I thought, how could I create some kind of device to make sure that designers actually could see their identities as they work? And so then this positionality wheel is something that I ask my students to do every semester. I've been asking them to do this for about 4 years. Well, different students in different schools, where we explicitly talk about at least these 12 elements of identity. Before the pandemic, people used to do this individually on a sheet of paper. I'd give them a little bit of time to fill out everything, and then we'd talk about it a little bit. But then in the pandemic, the activity changed, and then we started to do them together, like you can see on the slide on the right, where everyone in the class would write down their age or something like that. Everyone would write down their race. And then we would talk about that a little bit, you know, like so that we could start to see the collective identity of the group of people who were looking at whatever issue we were looking at. And that would help us to see maybe elements of our identity that we don't normally see. So, like, actually, with this group that did this is a group in Trinidad. And, you know, one of the students, after doing this wheel, actually said, you know, I thought that our perspective was a little bit more diverse than it actually is. You know, because it was a team of people of color, you know, they kind of assumed there was a different kind of diversity. And then when they actually put everything on the wheel, they were able to see, well, actually, everybody's from the same racial and ethnic group, everybody's from the same class, everybody's speaking the same language. Or sometimes we'll see a lot of diversity where it might not be very obvious. So this is something that I've asked people to do quite often, right? Um, the next slide is actually what you wanted to talk about a little bit, and you could interrupt me and ask more questions, right? But this is the designer's critical alphabet, which actually started with these 3 slides, or maybe even started before here, right? Because I was co-teaching a class where students had to go out and do some interviews with people. And then when they came back to report back on the interviews, I felt that people had kind of interviewed people who were very similar to themselves, which actually is not very unusual, you know, because most of us would feel pretty comfortable with people who are similar to us in some way. And I was the outsider in that group, you know, as a black woman from the Caribbean, as a non American. And so actually, I might have been able to see the similarity in all of the people that they interviewed in a particular way just because I was an outsider. You know, the same way if someone was an outsider looking at my group of students in Trinidad, they might have seen also where everyone is talking to the same person. So what happened after the students started to interview, after they reported back on their interviews, I was trying to see how could I get students to consider many more diverse perspectives in the problem area that they were looking at. We were looking at sustainability issues. And so and I also wanted to introduce a little bit of theory so that I didn't just say, well, okay, come, just change your user. I wanted them to think a little bit more about something as they worked. So I created these first three cards about critical race theory, about feminist theory, and then because I didn't want everything to be like so polemic, I also
Right.
created this card about the eyes of the child, right?
Yeah.
And then what I did is I dropped one of the cards on the table and then told the students, well, okay, now you have to change the perspective of the user that you were thinking of, and align them with one of these theory cards that you have here, right? And so afterwards, I kind of analyzed, well, not analyzed, I listened to their discussion, and thought that they were starting to consider more diverse perspectives just after a little bit of this discussion. And, really, I wasn't trying to get them to actually say, if my user is black, my product will change in this way. I just wanted them to start to have the questions and have the conversations, and also to recognize where they did not have enough information, where they had to go back out and talk to more people, where they had to figure out who were they going to add to the team to figure out, to be able to respond to these questions. So the
So
alphabet, yes, yes, David.
sorry to interrupt, but so these
Mm-hmm.
would kind of be used in a user persona situation where you're putting together user personae, and then you would introduce these, for example, and that would cause, in a research setting, to
Right.
reevaluate and rethink about them from different perspectives. Is that
Yeah,
sort of okay?
kind of, because they didn't start with personas, they started with real people.
Okay, that's
Yes,
interesting.
right?
That okay,
Yeah, yes, yeah. So, they started with the real interviews,
yeah,
and
gotcha.
then the people that they interviewed were all pretty similar.
Right.
And then the idea here was for them to think a little bit more deeply about
That's
what
okay. That's
happens
amazing.
if,
Yeah.
yeah, and the answer sometimes is nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing changes if, for some products, nothing is going to change if the person's race or gender or age changes. But for other products or,
But it's
other
like
problems,
it's
yeah,
so
it is.
it's brilliant because it's like throwing a curveball into what you think is a pretty solid, design
Yes,
process. And then all of a sudden, like you throw these curveballs in, they're really brilliant and they're just like little. The other thing that is interesting about them is it's kind of like a game. Like it has like the
yes,
mechanics of a game. And so
yes,
it's engaging in that way. Like you don't know what you're gonna get. And
yes,
there's a win on the horizon. There's like a way. There's like a victory condition somehow, but it's
yeah.
it's different than a typical game, and I just love that. I just love the how immediate they are. But anyway,
No,
continue.
no,
I'm
but
sorry.
you are perfectly right. And, so, I mean, maybe you know this, talking about race, gender, sexuality, um, identity, all of this is difficult work, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so I really was actually trying to gamify things a little bit
yeah,
so that I didn't have to be pointing fingers at, I mean, who wants to be doing that? Pointing
yeah,
fingers at people, or kind of trying to say, well, okay, I'm the person who understands X and you don't. So
yeah.
yeah.
It does kind of rob, like for example, critical race theory, as you I'm sure are aware, is like an incredibly hot button issue in
Yeah.
like the stupidest of places, like high school and middle
Yes.
school. It's like the board meetings across the country, school board meetings, where it would never appear on the curriculum. Obviously, there's this manufactured outrage of it. This, what you've done is sort of like you've sort of like subversively put it into a college curriculum, but done it in a way that kind of robs it of its outrage, and it's now just part of a design process. So
Yeah.
kudos to you. It's
Yeah,
brilliant. It's
and the thing is, it's just, I mean, as you would know, every, like, if all this these polemic issues are just things that we need to talk about,
Yeah.
so like let's talk about critical
It
race
creates
theory.
discussion. It
Let's
creates a space
Yes,
for it. Yeah, it's brilliant.
yes.
Okay.
um so what happened over time after I created the alphabet is that during my PhD, which I didn't really talk about, but I'll go back to maybe for a second, um, I had to do all of this critical reading because my PhD was done through what is called a critical pedagogy lens, right? And so critical pedagogy is tied to making students aware of the world around them, and aware of the forces that might be keeping people back. And, it is about creating like transformative spaces and transformative learning. So, as I continue to teach that class where I brought in those first three cards, I started to think about some of the other concepts that I had read about during the PhD from critical pedagogy, and how could I bring these terms that could seem inaccessible, right? How could I bring them into the design classroom? And how could I make them easy for designers to understand? Because I don't know about other designers, but I learned to design chairs, chairs and bottles, and I don't know what else, but I mean, I really was never discussing race and identity. And, even though I studied in Brazil, um, we didn't discuss those things in the design class. I mean, I was in a space in my university that actually was very political, but we didn't have those conversations about politics and society in design. We had them in the elevator, we had them in the lunch, in the cafeteria. All of my friends were from social sciences and anthropology. And, so that's where I got maybe this broader understanding of the world. But these cards then were about trying to take some of these things that people in sociology or social sciences might be talking about and bring them into design, because they do affect what we do as designers. We have to understand, I'll just look here, we have to understand marginalization,
Yeah.
or what else? I don't know if there's any
Well,
card that jumps out at you.
well, yeah. I mean, here's where I'm coming thinking. I was reading your book,
Mm-hmm.
the book you edited, The Black Experience in Design, and one of the articles in there is talking about implicit bias in technology, right? So
Mm.
like the biometrics in an Apple Watch, because of their sensors in the watch, right? It has to interact
Yes.
with the skin, and turns out, right? Surprise, surprise, they don't work so well with skin of color. Like the darker
Yes.
the skin, the less reliable, right? And
Yes.
then last year, right around this time, in a lecture series, I was talking to an artist named Dennis Delgado, who
Mm-hmm.
researches, and his work is all about well he does a lot of different things, but his work at that point was about facial recognition, and how
Mm-hmm.
facial recognition has implicit bias built into it. It's
Yes.
better at has more reliable with white Caucasian faces,
Mm-hmm.
and that sound okay, so it sounds terrible from a product design standpoint, but then when you consider that the NYPD and other police organizations around the country and the world are using these things
Mm-hmm.
to identify potential criminals, and they're misidentifying people of color, well, then you
Yeah.
have to talk about systemic racism, intersectionality,
Yes.
marginalization, right?
Yes.
It's like these are things that would come up like I would bring them up in my class all the time, but like this is interesting because it makes it like bite sized and
Yeah.
kind of cute. I don't know how else, I don't know whatever words, but it's like a cute, fun, engaging way to have these really difficult
Heavy
conversations,
conversations.
heavy
Yes.
conversations
Yes.
that
Yes.
I
Yes.
don't even fully feel completely equipped to discuss,
Yes.
because
But
I
but
don't,
even I don't
yeah,
actually,
yeah,
and early on when I started talking more about race in class, in the classes that I was teaching, I was actually like
yeah,
very afraid. I'm like,
wow,
how am I gonna go into like I taught at two private schools and I'm at a public university right now. But my thing was, how am I gonna go into a private, predominantly white institution and talk about race, with students who are very rich, whose parents could be calling and complaining, and
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
It's kind of the opposite where I teach. I am like,
yeah,
I'm a white cisgender male, and I mean, the majority of my students are people of color, women. Like I
hmm
feel I'm very much an ally, but I feel unequipped to really be a reliable messenger in these sorts of discussions. But something like this, it's better than a book, right? Nobody wants to read a book. If I have to sit and read it, although I love your book. I
no, no,
love the
no,
book
no.
you
I'm
edited.
I'm right there with you.
But it's
but
like
but
there,
that is it. This someone asked me. Um, I call this tapas.
yeah,
Where you're just getting, like you said, little bites.
yeah, that's it.
And
Tapas.
actually somebody called me out once for it, and they said, "Well, you are trivializing these heavy concepts." And I'm like, actually, I mean, that's not the intent. The intent is really to
No, of course
just
not.
give people these bite-sized portions, and then
Right.
each card ends with a question, and the aim of the question is to get people to go a little bit further,
Yeah.
because you know if you start to understand marginalization, you will start to see it everywhere.
Yep.
Like the first
Yep.
question is just to open up your eyes for
Yep.
you to see, oh, this stuff exists. And then
There
you'll start
was,
to see it everywhere.
it's exactly right. And there was something I keep going back to the book. I have a note here that there was just the idea of being exposed to something, which is in some cases enough to do it. I forget what it was called, but it was just, oh yeah, the mere exposure effect. It's referenced in the book, and it's like just exposing people just merely to the idea,
Yes,
right, is a radical thing, and it can change everything.
yes,
And it might take years, but it can change everything
yes,
about the way someone looks at something. And you're right, it's like you put the seeds in, and it's going to change how you see things. Your whole ideology will change. So
yes.
it's
So
it's
before
incredible.
we talk
Yeah.
about the book, I want to
Yeah.
talk about maybe two other things that build on what you are talking about, like just planting these seeds, and getting people to open their minds and their worldviews. So, okay, I put this slide up, but actually I'm going to change to this slide. So, in the bio, you read something that probably meant nothing to people, right? But it's actually the thing that I'm probably most excited about. So, I'm the co-chair of this group called the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group. And we borrow our name from a book called Designs for the Pluriverse by Arturo Escobar. And I will oversimplify what the concept of the pluriverse is. But the idea of the pluriverse is that we don't live in one world. Universe suggests that we live in one world. But the idea of the pluriverse is that there are many worlds that many different people are kind of inhabiting at the same time. And so, in a lot of the work that I'm doing, I am just getting people to consider a world that is beyond the world that they're in. You know, we don't have to go beyond that, but I just want you to um, open up your mind and your eyes, and to that idea of worlds beyond the worlds that you're in. So before I started working on that book, The Black Experience in Design, I had students at Tulane University, where I used to teach. I had students do interviews with designers all over the world, and this was related to um, opening their mind, and having them broaden the way that they think about design, and I wanted to make sure that students didn't think that design was only white, that it was only American or European, that design had to somehow include a certain kind of technology, or, so we collected about 30, I think 33 interviews with designers. Some of them were in New Orleans, where I was based at the time. Some were in California. Some were in Trinidad. Some were in. We got a few people from different places in Africa. I don't think we got any Europeans. We got some Asian possibly more Asian American, but all of these different perspectives to get students to open up the way they might frame design and who is a designer and what is design and all of that, right? Um, and so a lot of my work is about that, just having people think about design in many, many different ways. So yeah, I just wanted to talk about that for a second
Mm,
before, because there's that whole thing of just opening up people's frame of
yeah.
what design is.
This
Yes?
is I'm glad you did this because I've been using the word pluriversal more and more
Ah, good.
amongst my colleagues, and I just want to like I didn't make up the word, and it's like a
Yeah.
real thing, and it's really it could be another name for this lecture series for what we're
Yes.
talking about this semester about what it means to inhabit a pluriverse and how does that fit
Yes.
into design. So I appreciate you
Yes.
codifying it for me.
Yeah, there are many worlds, and
Yeah.
well, we might not even inhabit one. We all, with
Yeah.
all of our many different identities, we might inhabit a few worlds, which sometimes we
Yeah.
have to learn to see. And then we also have to see that other people live in different worlds, and it's okay. It's just
Yeah.
that realization that our way is not the only way.
Yeah.
That's something that's like, if you have to look for a learning objective in many of my classes, that's really the learning objective, just to
Yeah.
have that comfort with knowing that there are other worlds.
It's also, I mean, you say it so eloquently, but it's actually pretty radical. And it's funny because it's radical like traditionally, from a historical perspective, because you have Pedagogy of the Oppressed up here by Paulo Freire, which is like,
Yeah.
considered Marxist by some, and it's like Marxism is applied to education. It's one of my like go-tos. I love that book. And then
Yes.
the Parable of the Sower, which is more of like a
Yes.
non, a fiction, but
Yes.
eerily prescient in some ways. I mean, it's
Yes.
these are all
So,
books that everyone watching should read, by the way.
so okay, I'll
Yeah,
explain why we have a slide with books here, and I'm
yeah,
supposed to be
yeah.
talking about my work. So one of
That's
the things
okay.
that
That's
we
okay.
do,
You have to
one of
read.
the,
Got people got to read.
right, yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
we run a book club
Okay.
in the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group. And we are always looking for slightly radical books that we think that designers should be reading that will change their practice, right? We move around. We select a theme for a semester, and that theme is often selected around geography, but sometimes it's selected around other identities. So one semester we did Latin America. We've looked at books from the Caribbean. We've looked at Black and African and African diaspora authors. Right now, we're looking at authors from Asia. And, we also have presenters sharing their perspective who are often designers, but sometimes not. We look for these presenters who would normally have marginalized identities, and then they share these works with us. And then we have these really radical discussions about design outside of the traditional, let's say, Euro American tradition of design, right? So, actually, one book that maybe I'll recommend to your audience, which one of our presenters presented last week, is How Much Should a Person Consume, which is about environmentalism in India and in the United States. And there are a couple of phrases in that book that are just mind blowing, but one that really has stuck with me for the last 2 weeks is that environmentalism did not exist before industrialization. So the reason we have to be environmentalists is because we have industrialization, and then the other thing that stuck with me is how, and this is a very pluriversal idea, where the author says that really the way environmentalism is dealt with in the US is completely different to the way that it is dealt with in India, because in the US, environmental spaces are often spaces without people. And in India, according to the author, which many of us might have seen with our own eyes, people are everywhere. So you're not going to do environmentalism with these like reserves and natural parks and whatnot. But that's why it's important for us to understand these different worlds, because as we do the work that we do as designers, we have to understand that people are framing these questions through their questions through completely different worldviews. You know, we can't assume that everyone is going to use the mobile phone in the same way, because there might be different views informing the way that we use the things that we make and design. So, just a little bit about that.
No, that's great.
Um, I know that there was a question in the
Oh yeah,
thing.
just about it's crafting questions is an art form. I'm interested in your process crafting the questions featured on each designer's critical alphabet card.
So, that process was actually much longer than people would realize,
Yeah.
right? Um, it was a very iterative process where um, I'd make a deck of the cards, and then I would talk with people. I mean, literally, first I was handwriting these cards and showing people, and then asking them what they thought about the question and asking them if the question was clear. But really, a lot of the questions are to promote some kind of reflection. Like, let's see, I have a card next to me. Let's see, what is the question? So I'm looking at questioning mindset. And the question here, which is, I guess, a little bit of a riddle. Have you tried using questions to identify opportunities, reveal underlying needs, and understand your user's question? This question isn't so deep, but it is, there's always a question there to try to immediately get people to apply whatever the definition is, right? And, you know, a kind of funny, or not funny, maybe an interesting aside, you know, I'm sure that a lot of people um, in your program speak several languages, right? So um, I used to teach both Portuguese and English. And so, one thing about when you are teaching a language is that as you introduce a new term, you have to immediately get people to use the term, right? And you have to get them to use the term a few different ways for the thing to stick, you know? So, you have to get them to listen to it, you have to get them to say it, you have to get them to read it, you have to. And I guess maybe I'm using that language skill with these terms, because it's like me introducing 30 new words into people's vocabulary, and then immediately I have to try to get them to use it. So that, I guess you could say that that's related to the process of questions.
That kind of sounds like call and response, but like in a sort of more academic, rigid setting, which is another thing. Like call and response
Hmm.
is an indigenous mechanism. It's how a lot of indigenous music is structured, and of course,
Yes.
it's been co-opted by the blues and rock and roll, and eventually white people, and sold back as music, right? But it's I mean, it's a very classic indigenous tool like across the world, and yet
Yeah.
here it is as like a design process. I mean, it's really very interesting. And by the way, I just for everybody else, I put in the chat a link to the critical alphabet cards. They're kind of all listed here on this website of yours, thecriticalalphabet.com, that you can everybody can look at and
Yes.
look. But there's also a place where you can buy the cards up at the top. So, and I would recommend everybody do that. It's like I mean, you keep them there while you're designing something, and it's like a great way to like push your process along. So,
And
um,
you know, and something that I like to ask people to do is tell me what you would put into the alphabet, right? So, like, you know, I talked about positionality a little bit earlier. Positionality is related to our identities. So, one thing I like people to remember is that these cards are actually somehow tied a little bit to my positionality. So, you know, maybe somebody else would create a different critical alphabet, and I'm always interested to hear what they would do differently.
yeah, I mean, I know that I would. I would. It would be. I mean, it's funny. Like I'm actually working on a game right now that
Mm,
requires prompts, and the prompt cards, and it's eerily similar to this. That's why I'm thinking gaming.
Mm-hmm.
And and it's like very difficult to write them, like writing them. And I feel like I'm just one person. I mean, a game, for example, like Cards Against Humanities, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a very popular game. It's a party game. It's universally beloved, and it's kind of also adult and X-rated in some points. But there is like a whole team of writers writing these things, right?
Yeah.
It's a whole, they're professional writers. That is where they put all
Yeah.
their money. There is no
Yeah.
other money that goes into that game. It's all about developing the prompts. They're so critically
Yeah.
important. So it's like I know that couldn't do this. I couldn't do this very well. So again, I have
Well,
to.
I guess maybe to just to add to your sentence and maybe to come back to respond to the person's question. The first set of questions that I wrote for the alphabet, I did not really do alone, because I was writing them and then always checking in with other people to see, well, okay, what did you think? What did you think? What did you think? How would you
Yeah,
change this?
yeah,
And I think that that was very important in the development of the alphabet. There was another deck that I was working on at the same time as the alphabet, where I actually acknowledged every single person who answered a question for me. But then that deck never became, that deck I was working on for an organization, and then it never became public, right? And maybe I need to do the same thing with this alphabet, but actually there were so many people along the way that I don't recall every single person
right,
who gave
right.
feedback, right?
That's okay. That's okay. At least you tried.
Yes.
You
I
tried.
tried. I think about everyone,
Yeah.
right?
No.
Let me see. Should I move into the Black experience in
Yeah.
design?
I think it's a great segue into that. And I'll put a link to this book in the chat for everybody
Yeah.
while you kind of launch into it. It's just an incredible book.
Yeah, and I mean, we will talk about this book for 10 minutes when we could talk about it for 3 hours,
More
right?
than that. More than
Yes.
that. Yeah.
Uh, but just like a quick overview, so I am one of 6 editors in the Black Experience in design, and the lead editor is Anne Berry, and I got a phone call somewhere in June 2020, I'll assume, right? Where someone said, "Hey, do you want to be part of this project?" And I listened and I listened. And the project wasn't well formed yet. We just knew, Anne knew. Um, Actually, I don't remember if it was Anne who reached out to me or Kelly, but whoever reached out to me said, "We want to do something in the wake of George Floyd's murder, in the way of all of this attention that people are placing on blackness and the black community. And, we want to do something a little bit more intentional about, well, as a response." So the editors are Anne Berry, who I said is the lead editor, Jennifer Rittner, who is in New York. She's the development editor. Kelly Walters, who's also in New York, was the creative director. And then Kareem Colley, he is a designer at IBM. He was a professor, I think, maybe when we started the project, and then he did the smart thing and left academia, went to the corporate world,
Making
and
some real
then
money now. Yeah.
yeah, and then Penina Akayo Laker, who's also a professor, and then myself, right? So all 6 of us met for several weeks where we were trying to figure out what it was that we wanted to do. And we started off talking about um, doing a special issue of a journal, because academics always talk about journal articles, and we said, well, let's do an academic journal where we talk about blackness in design, because you know what happened after George Floyd's murder, everyone started to pay attention to blackness and the black community and blah 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 blah. So we
Yeah.
got a lot of questions of, oh, where are the black designers? Where can we help these black designers? How can we give black designers work and whatnot? And I think we all had varying responses to those kinds of questions.
Yeah,
Um, I was actually very angry. Anytime I heard any of those questions, I got angry,
yeah,
because I felt that the design industry had really ignored a lot of black designers, and then all of a sudden you're asking, where are they? They were always there, and they are there, but maybe you weren't taking anyone on, right? You weren't
yeah,
hiring black designers. You weren't, and so all of a sudden you're wringing your hands and trying to figure out where are these black designers. And
yeah,
so, like, when I joined this project, one of my interests was how do we make sure that people see, one, that there are many black designers, two, that they're black designers who are making their own success. I mean, yes, it was great that people were interested in them at that point, but people would make their own success regardless of whether the corporate world or the non-black world, regardless of whether all of these people were interested in it or not, people were going to make their own success, right? And so we sat down and we brainstormed about what this thing could be, when we realized it could not be a special issue of a journal, because a journal is only going to have 6 articles or something like that, and we wanted many more stories like that. And then we started to imagine throughout names, go through LinkedIn, try to see, well, who do we want to collect these stories from? And we just started to reach out to people. We as we brainstormed about who we wanted involved, we started to create the chapters, and
and
then
the
we reached out to
structure,
people.
yeah,
Yes, the structure of the book we started to create, and
yeah.
then we reached out to people, and
Because some of it's
that's it.
thematic, right? I mean, some of it's about
Yes,
design education, some of it's about historical perspectives, and some
yes,
of it's about like a black identity in design, like and if such a
yes,
thing exists, and like it's just like
yes,
it's a fascinating look into what does that even mean, and
yes.
it the book makes the point in a few different articles that actually right in the introduction that and you kind of alluded, we were kind of talking about this before, that when people say design they think graphic design, and there's a deeper issue, which is that when people say graphic design they really mean like mid-century Swiss design, right?
Yeah.
Because that, and the reason is because it's seen as completely objective.
Mm-hmm.
It like the clean lines, the new typography.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have a an agenda, or it doesn't appear to have an agenda,
Yeah,
and
I'll
there,
say that. It doesn't
which is, it
appear.
doesn't appear to have an agenda, but
Yes.
it actually does,
Yeah.
right? And the book makes the point that there are black designers everywhere. It's just that they are sort of caught in this systemic system where they're taught to kind of code switch and
Yes.
and imitate Swiss
Yes.
design. Could you
Yeah.
comment on
So
that?
like so so there's I don't even know where to start. There's so much to say. I think that there is an essay. Let me see if I could find it. There's an essay by Steve Jones that I would recommend that every student read, if they are not from the mainstream or the dominant group, right? So if they're not white cis male, um, English speaking, all that, read this essay by Steve Jones, because it seems like Steve Jones is writing to you, where he says your professor will make it clear in not so many words that your self portrait, because he refers to an assignment that everybody has to do, where they have to make a self portrait. And then he talks about people whose self portrait isn't good enough for the professor for whatever reason, right? So he says that your self portrait isn't sufficiently good because your biography, your lived experience is too foreign to him, something that he cannot relate to. The language, artifacts, and confessions that comprise your work is something that he has never encountered, and therefore does not meet whatever familiar criteria he envisioned a work on self identity should be. And you'll think to yourself, my identity is central to who I am and how I see the world. How can a professor diminish a project on self identity because he's not familiar with it? And I'm sure that a lot of people um, have experienced this. Even if you appear to be from the dominant group, it could be that you experience this um, because, like, I have a really close friend, a close person in my life who is white, who is male, and is from Asheville, North Carolina, and talks about exclusion because of their accent, or, so I mean,
Oh,
even if you're
yeah.
from, yeah,
Well,
even if you're
especially up,
from
yeah.
the dominant group, you're probably being excluded in some way.
Oh, that's
But
totally true
yes,
of Southerners, American from
yes,
the US that come to New York. I mean,
yes,
we definitely look down on them. And there's some
right.
brilliant, I'll be the first to admit it. It's not a racial thing. It's
Yeah,
purely cultural, and it's
yes,
about. I mean, there's got to be a word for it, but it's about the inflection of the voice,
yeah,
and it's age old. It goes back to like pre-Civil War, right? And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
and some of the smartest, most brilliant people I've ever worked with are from the South, right? As it turns out, when you,
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
and I'll add to that. So some of the smartest, most beautiful people in our worlds are from outside of the dominant group, you
exactly,
know? And
yeah.
so, like, like early on after we published this book, someone asked me, they might have asked me something like, how do we use this book or something like that. And actually, I had to say, if you have ever been excluded in any way,
Yeah,
this book will help situate you, even if you're not a black designer. This book offers some
absolutely.
strategies for thriving, so like
Oh,
my favorite chapter
sorry about that. Yeah.
is, let me see if I could find the name of the chapter. I think it's chapter 5, but it's a chapter with, actually it's not chapter 5, it's chapter 8, which is called Radical Collective Radical and Liberatory Spaces in Design.
Right.
And what I, well, okay, so I'm the editor of that chapter, right? But what I love about that chapter is that even though people are telling their stories of exclusion, the whole chapter is about liberation, right? Where, so, like there's Malini Barnett who's talking about being excluded in the world of interior design and how she created her own guild and association. And, like if you look for Malini Barnett on Instagram, for example, she has tens of thousands of followers on Instagram. So she is now in a space where she doesn't need all the people who excluded her, right? She's made her own space, And another person with that kind of story is Terrence Moline, who was he was in New Orleans as a graphic designer, but somehow needed to create a space for himself, and created the African American Graphic Design Association. Maurice Cherry, who has the Revision Path podcast, his story is a little bit similar, where he was rejected by, I don't remember which, somebody did not pick up um, his deal and his program and whatnot, and then he created his own space. So he has this podcast that is, it was added very early on to the collection in the permanent collection of the African American Museum in DC. And so all these people are telling these stories of exclusion, and then how they just moved on from that and they created their own spaces. And for me, like, that's the part of the book that I love the
Yeah.
most,
That's the emancipation that you're
Yes.
discussing.
Yes.
So I have one more question about the book, but we don't have a lot of time. Did you want to talk about what you're working on now?
Yes, I have so many things
Okay.
to talk about, right?
I know.
But
I feel like
I'll
we have
say
another we have
with
another hour or
regard
two.
to
Yeah.
this book,
Yeah.
people have to end the book with Adrienne Marie
Okay.
Brown's
I'm writing this
very
down.
short
So,
essay.
okay.
Because, and she ends with, this is our time, and that's all people have to think about,
Yeah,
if they've ever been excluded, right?
I agree.
I am working on another book. Notice the same background, um,
Right.
which will appear in this book because Che Lovelace's art is going to be in this book, right? So I'm working on a book called Design Social Change. And in that book, so that book actually started off as a recipe book for making change, where I started off thinking about ingredients that people had to combine to get to social change. And so it's a very short book. It's a one of the D School has a series that they're releasing, like every few months they're releasing one book. So this book will be released actually a little while from now, fall 2023. I think it will go live on Amazon in January, but it will be released in late summer or fall 2023. But I'm asking people to think about what they need to do to make change. So one thing is that we have to know ourselves. We have to figure out, we have to know ourselves. We have to start to um, understand what our change agenda is. Really, really important. And this is like a Freirean concept. We have to recognize oppression so that we as designers can think about how are we changing what's not wrong. We have to learn to see and listen to other people to get that. We have to focus on equity. We have to be emotionally intelligent. We have to be a little bit oppositional sometimes, and create problems, and then work with other people. And we have to design new worlds and futures. So, I mean, that's like just a tiny, tiny glimpse of what I'll be doing in that book, where I'm going through. It is a book about design, but for anybody, because
Yeah,
I'm really not trying to use designerly language. Where I use it, I try to break it down into
yeah.
very accessible language about making social change. Um, and I'm trying to see how we could use our approaches as designers, of prototyping things and trying things out to just get to that space where we're trying things out and making change.
It's amazing. It's really amazing. You say it like so easily, but it's so incredibly radical, like in some ways. But like that's what's great about being a designer, right? Like we can
Yeah.
talk about like what if we tried this and it happens to be like a
Yes.
crazy idea that most people would be like, oh, we can't do that. But like
Yeah.
designers can't say we can't do that.
No,
Every
we
idea is
do
on the
this stuff.
table. We do the
Exactly.
work. It's amazing.
Yes. Yes.
One last question.
Mm-hmm.
In this
And I
is
could stop sharing if you want so that we can
Oh
see
yeah,
each
this
other.
is a,
Yeah.
and you can just give me, we could just chat about this.
Yeah.
The in the book, there's this great article about the history of the golden rectangle, the golden proportions, and how actually it goes back to African, in some cases, sub-Saharan African architecture, predating the Greek civilization
Yeah.
and then going up the Nile because it was in a lot of Nilotic cultures you'll find it right
Mm-hmm.
pre Greek and even in the Temple of Karnak, which is like probably one of the most renowned Egyptian pharaonic structures in existence. Still, there's
Yes.
clear proportions. Could you just comment like what do you think about that and in general how can that sort of be used to make this point that in actuality there's always been African design, there's been Black
Yeah.
design, and it's been kind of co-opted and devoured by Western culture more
Yes.
generally.
Huh. So that's an article by Audrey Bennett, which I
Yeah,
thought
Audrey
was
Bennett, that's right.
fascinating. Um, I I mean, I don't. I think Audrey Bennett's this historical work that she has done, and then this work that Cheryl Miller has done as well. Where Cheryl is talking about the use of color in
Hmm.
African American design. And
Yep.
the history of color choices. Like there's a particular color that Cheryl talks about, and it's called goldenrod yellow that
Uh-huh.
she says that you find in a lot of African American print work. And I think it is exciting to hear about that kind of design history that is not told,
Yeah.
right? Um, when I think of history, so I always protest against design history, which
Yeah.
I don't have to, but I do to make a point because I think that people sometimes lose perspective on why we learn history, right? You know, we don't learn history to memorize all these facts. We
No.
don't have to memorize that Walter Gropius did whatever, whatever,
Right.
whatever.
Yeah.
But we need history to understand a certain place and time. And we can do that with local histories and local
Yeah.
design histories. So like if I wanted to create my own design history course, it would be about people going out and finding that local history and then writing that, which is a little bit what we were doing with the podcast, you know, having people
Yeah.
going out and um, collecting stories and then writing that history rather than people just learning off history out of context. That's
Yeah.
really what the issue is for me with design history. So I'm very, very happy when I see that historical canon broadened. And I think that there are other ways that we could be doing these design history courses that so many people teach.
That's fascinating. Okay. Well, that's on, I mean, we could
Yeah.
talk for another 3 hours. And hopefully we do offline, but thank you so much for meeting with us. Really appreciate it. I put the different books that you've been involved in and that you mentioned in the chat for everybody. Lesley-Ann Noel, thank you so much. Please have a good night. And I have other stuff to ask you. I have all this other stuff. I'm just going to email it to you
Yes,
because
yes,
we have
yes,
like lots to talk about. Thank
yes.
you again. And thank you everybody for coming tonight. And please join us next week where we're actually going to be meeting with one of the artists in the show in the gallery and talking about her work. So it's going to be an interesting sort of shift in perspective.
Yes.
Thank
All
you,
right. Well,
everybody.
thank you so much for the invitation and have a
Of
great night,
course,
everyone.
you too. Thank you so much.
Okay, then. Bye
All
bye.
right. Bye bye.